The last panel is on public-private partnerships as a solution to financial challenges. And I'm going to introduce the moderator of that panel as the panelists come up. The moderator is Jerry Cross, who's a longtime friend through our work together with the Pennsylvania Economy League. Jerry is the executive director of the Central Pennsylvania Economy League throughout Pennsylvania. You just heard from Brian Jensen, who is the executive director out in the western part of the state. We also have a regional economy league here in Philadelphia, headed by Steve Ray. And the Economy League does great work on the things we've been talking about, intergovernmental cooperation, how we can get regions to work together and better. And Jerry is a master of that. That is his stock in trade. Jerry knows that we have far too many authorities and local government units in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania probably has more than all of the other states put together, believe it or not. And Jerry is also a master on what to do with distressed municipalities. We have far too many distressed municipalities in Pennsylvania, and Jerry has been working in that area with Act 47. He's been involved with the Harrisburg receivership, and he's also been involved in his own community in northeastern Pennsylvania, working with Scranton. So with no further ado, I'm going to introduce Jerry Cross. Jerry, take it away.
Thanks, David. I appreciate it. Our panel today for public-private partnerships might be misnamed. It's you'll hear from public partnerships today, particularly as the solution to some financial problems in the city of Allentown, and as a potential solution to some problems, longstanding legacy costs in the city of Scranton. Our panel today, I'll introduce from my right is Ed Bielarski, Chief Operating Officer and Chief Financial Officer for the Lehigh County Authority. Julio Guridy of the City Council of Allentown, Council President, and one of the leaders of the deal to get the city's water supply concession over to the Lehigh County Authority. Following Julio is Mayor Chris Doherty, City of Scranton, longtime three-term mayor. He's on his last victory lap right now, not running for a fourth term, and we'll hear from Chris. And at the very end is Bill Rhodes, partner from Ballard, Spahr, and Bill has a presentation we'll go through in a minute. It's no surprise that many municipalities in Pennsylvania and around the country are facing financial problems of an unprecedented scope. Often these pressures are not related to the current level of expenses for payroll and operations. Much of the fiscal stress seen today comes from the prior cost of doing business. Pension costs and retiree health care costs have coupled with increased employee health care to confound the best budget planners and elected officials as they simultaneously try to provide current services for citizens, pay for past employment, and the benefits granted by their predecessors. And when you overlay that on with the green infrastructure requirements for smaller systems, particularly in the size of what we're talking about today, it becomes very onerous when you look at a fee-based payback for some of these mandates. At the same time, outside regulatory and legislative forces are combining to make a municipality's base operations very expensive and difficult. Environmental mandates require capital and the resultant higher fees. When you combine that with higher taxes, and many municipalities are looking to divest, partner with, or just leverage their utility assets to provide more than just the utility services the citizens are used to. We'll have Bill Rhodes give us an overview of the issues, concerns, and opportunities of public-public and public-private partnerships. After Bill, we'll be examining the two cities' approaches to this current dilemma. Allentown has recently closed on a long-term lease concession of its water supply system for more than $210 million. This deal was necessitated by a city pension liability in excess of $180 million. Julio Guridy was a target for intense public opposition from both environmentalists and from citizens worried about increased fees on top of increased taxes for the possible loss of a water system to a private entity, or just the loss of control of what they thought was a very valuable asset, the water supply. We can hear from Julio on some of the obstacles he had to overcome. Ed Bielarski the CFO of the Lehigh County Authority, the eventual high bidder, will discuss what went into their decision for the authority to be the high bidder and how they were able to pay more than the private sector and yet still remain responsive to this region's overall system's water needs and rate base.
You mean the winning bidder, not the high bidder?
Oh, I'm sorry, the winning bidder, yes, not the high bidder. Agreed. Scranton City also has had a run of bad luck lately in its fiscal condition. The Mayor Doherty has recently had to deal with an overtly hostile council majority, as well as a hostile Pennsylvania Supreme Court majority. The latter issued a court award to the city's unions for more than $20 million, payable immediately. Matter of fact, the unions filed a judgment and threatened to sell City Hall last month. While Scranton City's local business environment has prospered under Mayor Doherty's 3 terms, the same unrelenting fiscal pressures of legacy costs and increases in non-operating expenses have created the need for the city to consider selling its multi-municipal sewer authority to address the city's structural deficit, its increasing pension liability, and its long-term debt. Bill, you want to come up and...
Sure. I'll do it from here so we can sort of treat this as an open forum and let people ask questions in the middle of it. As we were talking about doing this discussion, I offered to Jerry to do a couple overview thoughts that would help sort of form the discussion. So some of these are legal and some of these are financial. Let me add that in Pennsylvania, we're going to talk about P3, public-private and public-public partnerships. Pennsylvania has a fairly long history of significant private ownership of water and wastewater systems. So while there will be opposition to change in theory, that this is a market that should be relatively tolerant for the idea that private companies can and should be able to operate a water and sewer enterprise. But let's talk about some of the drivers on this, the legal and financial considerations. And this is just a partial list, to be honest. We heard about the effects on ratepayers through several speakers already today. That is one of the key issues that we, helping to put together financings, think about, and that the municipalities who are looking to maybe privatize or sell or monetize their system have to be wary of. A major driver, we're going to hear about this, is the fiscal health of the municipality involved. Often the capital needs of the facilities may be the biggest driver on it. It may be that there's consent orders or other requirements that are simply too much for the existing public operator to handle. O&M capacity, we heard about that, about whether you have a system, multi-million-dollar system, and do you have the technological capacity in local government to run it well? Is there a structure in one of these monetizations that maximizes low-cost capital? Low-cost capital can correlate to lower effects on ratepayers. There may be federal tax implications. There may be state law implications. There's undoubtedly labor issues, and there's probably some PUC regulations regardless of what state you're in. So the first one, effect on ratepayers, I'm going to go through these quickly so that you can hear from the others. Ultimately, this is a paramount consideration. Can the population afford the rate increases? There may be rate increases on the table regardless of whether you're monetizing the asset, but monetization can certainly bring the issue of rate increases to the table and make a very important element of the discussion come right to the top. And many of the issues that you talk about in these deals will ultimately have some effect on ratepayers. Purchase price can correlate to rate increases. Rate increases can depend on many of the following considerations that I'm going to talk about. The fiscal health of the municipality. We see this, Ed and Julio have become sort of rock stars now in Pennsylvania municipal government on the issue of monetizing their enterprises. A lot of people had looked at the traditional P3 privatization for Bayonne and Rialto and California Water, but the public all of a sudden has gotten everyone's attention. We have lots of people who reach out to us to talk about it and to explore whether it can work for them. But often the municipality comes to the table with different issues of their own. Do they have a structurally unbalanced budget? Can this kind of transaction actually address that problem? Can they convert an asset to cash and thereby use the cash to eliminate a long-term liability? Or do they need a long-term revenue source that would help them achieve a long-term structurally balanced budget? There's also some questions in some states, and Pennsylvania has this, about certain laws about the transfer of funds from authorities to municipalities, which had gone on widely in Harrisburg and some other places. There's newer state law since 2012 that puts a cloud on those types of transfers. So to the extent you've been doing those, you might need to look at this transaction as a way to either accelerate or make lawful the types of transfers that are occurring. So capital needs of the facility, some of the things that you worry about. Can you assign the consent order? Are there green infrastructure alternatives? You may have noticed before, climate change adaptation wasn't one of the drivers that I put on the list here, the things that cause these deals. But as these things are circular, green infrastructure may in fact be an alternative to some of the capital needs. And of course, the question for a mayor or someone is, if you haven't thought about that as a long-term opportunity before you go into a procurement to sell the system, you can probably bet that smart operators who might be bidding on it have thought about it. So are you leaving money on the table by not weighing those and factoring them into valuation? And then who bears CapEx risk? I think we'll talk about, Ed, situations where capital expenses, it can be transferred or not. O&M capacity, again, considering the qualifications of private versus public operator, this is probably part of the education thing. If the local population is afraid of change, it may be that educating them about economies of scale and the professionalism of outside operators might help to relieve some of those fears. Maximizing low-cost capital. Why do we want to maximize it? It minimizes the hit on ratepayers. If we can maximize low-cost capital, some of the things you want to think about are to what extent can tax-exempt bonds be issued? Can state revolving fund grants and loans, which are very attractive interest rates, can they be left in place or assigned over? And again, are there ways to incorporate green infrastructure? Federal tax exemption, the Lehigh County example worked well because you had different unrelated entities, but many municipalities have political control over the authority that runs it. If they wanted to simply transfer their equity, monetize their equity to the authority that's already in place, they may not be able to use tax-exempt finance. So we have to look at the questions on buyer and seller relations if there's going to be an acquisition financing between related parties. Labor issues. What about the existing workers? There may be significant differences between a public-private and a public-public transaction. And in public-public, there may be significant differences between the two workforces and the way that they have their collective bargaining agreements or their pensions. Some could be defined contributions, some might be defined benefit. Maybe they're both the same. Integration would be easier, but you're going to have issues on integration no matter what. PUC regulation, this is something that you have to worry about probably in every state. In Pennsylvania, a private operator would be subject to regulation. Service by a municipality within its boundaries would be exempt, and municipal authorities would have a wholesale exemption. They're not subject to PUC regulation on rate setting anyway. So again, that may be a driver on the structure that you want to think about. And I think that's the summary, and then the rest of the panel can talk about their examples.
Thanks, Bill. Julio, many of the items that Bill saw as potential liabilities or hurdles or obstacles, you overcame. If you'd like to expound on that for the Allentown City Lease.
Sure. How are you? Ready to go, probably. Well, you're right. We had a big pension problem in the city of Allentown, and it was police and fire primarily. And there were although we did significant restructuring of the police and the fire contracts, that really didn't solve the issue. So we have to look for alternatives to make sure that we can pay the MMO, the minimum municipal obligation of the city for the pension liability that we had, which was about $158 million, and probably a little bit more, depending on what the bond rates will be. And we were calculating at 8% at that time. There were many things that we discussed. Some of the things that we discussed obviously included bankruptcy in the city. And you know what happened in California and many other municipalities that, fortunately, even close to me, and Red in Pennsylvania. And those issues really scare many of us. And remember one thing, our budget is $90 million in the city of Allentown. We considered having probably a projected obligation, minimum municipal obligation of about $13 million this year. It was projected to be $18 million in 2 more years and about $25 million in 5 years. With a budget of 90%, you can understand how we felt. So we talked a lot about, what can we do? We didn't concentrate too much on what happened in the past and why it came to that situation, but we were there, so we decided that we were going to try to do something. And there were a couple of options. We thought that probably we can increase the millage rate. And Allentown, some of you may know, has the highest millage rate in the whole region. If you know Lloyd McCongie, they don't even pay taxes at all for the city, for the municipality. Option 2 included raising income taxes. Now, we have a big exodus in our city, and we have a city that is now composed of many poor individuals living in the center city, to make it blunt. And if we had increased our taxes, people would just fly out of the city. They've done it in the past, and they will continue to do. Option to reduce the unfunded liability in order to decrease the MMO. Another option was option 3, and that was a pension obligation bond. And this would be a taxable debt. So we decided, eventually we decided not to do that, not to go that route. Option 4 was to sell the water and sewer system to an authority and develop our own Allentown authority. And that would have also created a taxable debt for the city, and to pay with the water revenue. And we decided to go against that as well in the end. And he also may have required the city to guarantee the debt. City council hired. Let me back up a little bit. So all those things were in front of us. People were upset. As you know, some people I used to call them naysayers. I don't call them that anymore. But they were upset. They were coming to council, looking for us to do something about this, and they were afraid that the water rates were going to go up. They read all these terrible, horrible stories across the country on when you sell the most precious asset that we have, which was a water and sewer plant, and they were scared. So they threatened us with everything, our hands were tied basically in council. The administration was exploring anything possible. So they explored all these options. Eventually, we hired PEL to do a peer review on what's the name of the company here? PFM, the Public Financial Group, that was the city's consultant on the deal, to try to see if we can divest our assets and monetize it, so we can get some funding, so we can pay our unfunded pension obligation for the fire and police. So we hired Jerry Cross from PEL, Pennsylvania Economy League, and they came up and looked at different goals. What can we do to make sure that we keep our, at least maintain some of our assets? So we decided to obviously go with a lease conception agreement that we we were going to put out there. We did a RFP and finally got to kind of, the process wasn't that easy, but let me just fast forward. We got into an RFP and we had about 10 different companies, including U.S. Water, American Water, LCA, and we actually eventually got a lot more than what we were expecting. We wanted to get about 150, which was our debt, to $200 million. We eventually got $220 million for the agreement, and with a royalty fee of about $500,000 a year starting in 2015. So the main issues, I think, were because of the finances and because of the money that we owed, we really didn't have any way to go. Now, people were scared because of what they read about American Water, about some of these private companies. They felt that they were going to it was going to be a company that was going to come in and increase our water rates, and it was really an issue that we couldn't control at that time. However, what we did is we talked to the mayor. We asked the mayor to go out and do a dog and pony show and do presentation throughout the city to neighborhood and to individuals who wanted to hear and learn more about what we were doing with their water. And that worked out. I think, well, to some extent, I should say. And the reason is because although the presentations were real, they were proper, they were well done, the public didn't believe it, especially the people who were coming in. So council decided that we hire PL, do the peer review, and found out that that was the best option that we had on the table. And it was better than bankrupts in the city, than floating a bond, and any of the other, and actually of creating our own water authority, which would just transfer one debt to from another, So it was a turbulent situation, political situation. 5 of us in council were running for re-election. We were threatened that, they got 4 people to run against us, the public who was against it, and not everybody in the public. I mean, we have 120 plus residents in the city, so we had about 50 people that were coming to city council complaining and really didn't understand it. But it's not that they didn't understand it. I think it's that they just didn't want to understand it. It was a great partnership, I thought, but they felt, we had the Food and Water Group came in and they organized the communities and the people who were against the deal, and it was terrible for us because they would say things that were not true. I mean, they just, and people, the newspaper was there, the TVs were there, so all the media printed things that this other group was saying instead of reading what the actual agreement looked like. So we did a lot of research. We worked on it. We found out that it was a good deal. LCA came up with the best offered. They actually offered, we did a best and final offered, and that worked out, actually got us an extra almost close to $20 million.
You're welcome.
Thank you. But, then it was the issue of who's actually paying for this. So everybody said, well, the rate payers are going to pay for it. And there were a couple of things that, that people didn't really understand. If we would have done it, if we would have borrowed the money, we would have had to pay even more. The agreement actually indicated that there was it was 2.5% increase per year starting in 2015 above the CPI. The CPI has been 2% or less in the last 20, 40 years. And after the 20 years, 30 years, the next 30 years, it would have been, actually it was 30 years first, and then the next 20 years would have been 2% increase. So that would have been about 4.5% on the worst scenario. The city has been increasing the water rates about 5% annually prior to that. And sometimes you didn't get any increase, sometimes you got 5%, sometimes 7%, sometimes 10%. But the average was about 5%. eventually what happened is when we decided to go with that lease, we had a series of meetings, many hours. Sometimes we had meetings until 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. We had people from all walks of life, and people yelling at us and threatening us and not wanting to be quiet and when the time was up. But it was they still claimed, although we had plenty of meetings, they still claimed that the process was not transparent. But that's an issue that we have to deal with, and I'm sure you deal with it. So I think the ultimately we voted on it in April and voted on the agreement. Things turned out to be fine. The LCA took over in August of this year, and I think just this month we got the first bill from LCA, the first water bill from ACA. It was a concession agreement that we had a couple of things that we didn't want to concede on as a city, and some of those things were we wanted to make sure that we kept the same quality of water that we had before entering into an agreement. We wanted to make sure that our employees were taken care of. And LCA, it was fantastic that it was LCA, which is a nonprofit organization. The board is composed of members, commissioners who are appointed by the county commissioners in Lehigh County. And we wanted to make sure that the employees didn't lose their pension. So they had the same type of pension that we had in the city. And they knew how to deal with that issue. So that pacifies some of those problems, unforeseeable problems. And the last thing was making sure that the rate did increase dramatically. So that helped us out because we were not able to, because of the agreement, we didn't have to raise our rates. We didn't have to raise taxes. If we would have raised taxes, we would have to be raised about close to 200%. And it worked out well at the end. I'm very proud of it myself. And, all the threats that people say that they were going to make sure that we lose the campaign, actually, I was the top vote getter in the city that time. So it really didn't work. I think the issue is it wasn't about me. It wasn't about city council. It was about what can we do better for our citizens. And it worked. I think the majority of the people recognized that what we did was the right thing for the citizen and for the future of Allentown. So I'll stop for now.
Well, thank you, Julio. Now for the opposite, not the opposite, but the whoa,
The partner.
Julio was kind, and he called PEL in our office doing a peer review. The contract that we had with the city had two components. One was to outline for the public early on what their goals were from the sale of or the lease or the concession, the revenues from that, with the idea that this would bind the hands of the government, that when the money came in, they would use it for the specified purposes, and also if the money wasn't enough to solve the pension problem in the short and long term, that perhaps the city wouldn't go through with the deal. Against the backdrop of all that, the Lehigh County Authority was also looking at potential privatization of a large water system on their borders in the middle of your service area. So I think it'd be interesting to hear from Ed on the thoughts that went into the successful approach.
Sure. Well, thank you. This might get to be a little bit of inside baseball, but it was interesting hearing Julio's perspective on this, and I'll try to give you a little perspective as to what the Lehigh County Authority was thinking from a concession, merger, acquisition type basis. So the question posed to me was, what went into LCA's decision on the City of Allentown's concession, and how were you able to pay more than the competitors? The answer kind of begins with the old adage about credit. People have the ability to pay, but you also want them to have the desire to pay. And so that was kind of the situation with the authority. R.L. Arndt had been there. He was the CFO for about 40 years. And he had long looked at regionalization as something that would be good for the community. I affectionately called him the Dean of Water. I was more the Prince of Puddles when I came there. I had worked in the power business for about 20 years and actually managed a waste coal-fired power plant up in Nesquehoning, Pennsylvania. And we had done some tax-exempt financing, resource recovery bonds that were wrapped in a synthetic lease structure. Light bulb is kind of the structure that we set up for this whole concession arrangement. So at the time, in the same month that I started with the authority, the city released its RFP. Arl and I worked on a strategic basis to bid. And the bid process opened on the strong possibility that another party could be a counter-signatory to the host of water supply, wastewater capacity allocation, and service agreements that we had in place. As a result of the precipitation in the bid process was the first step in fending off an unwanted contract partner. This was our defense strategy, as we called it. As part of the overarching regionalization concept, LCA viewed its shared services, our executive staff, our customer service groups, our capital works, our engineering people. They were a resource that had additional capacity, and we viewed them as filling a void in the executive structure of the city water and wastewater system. They had a fine group of middle management people, union workers, but they really didn't have executive leadership. So we saw that as a reason that we need to interject ourselves into the bid process. Through the development of the bid model, it became evident that the city system had a robust economic basis. It threw off a lot of cash. It had a solid revenue stream, even in spite of some of the economic situations some of the people were in. It had a very reliable revenue base. In order to avoid conflict with our board and rate base, we decided that the concession could be financed on a standalone basis. In other words, we didn't have to include it in all of LCA's indenture. We could bifurcate the two, have a city suburban system, and sell it to Standard & Poor's as a new credit. It also was decided that we could do 100% financing. We developed the bid with an estimated weighted average cost of capital, our WACC, was about 4.5% to 5%. It was based on a mix of tax-exempt, zero coupon, and taxable bonds. And the interesting thing about that, we talked about some privates, and their WACC was a little different than that. I mean, you got to remember, we have a zero cost of equity. 100% financing, it's whatever you can finance it at. So you have the lowest cost of capital going in as a public entity. In hindsight, it was a little risky, this philosophy, moving forward without committed financing. We were going into the market with the sense that we'd issue tax-exempt bonds underwritten by Goldman Sachs and get the best deal we could. But it was the strategy, and the way we mitigated that was an interest rate protection vehicle in the concession agreement that was only partial, but for particular rises in the municipal bond rate, you would get a reduction in price. It wasn't fully hedged, but it was partially hedged, so that was one way we dealt with that. At the same time this was going on, I kind of churned away at the bid, and I developed a competitive model that was kind of a sanity checkpoint for me. And it was based on my expectation of what the competitors would look at this situation to be. I mean, I came from private industry, so I had a sense as to what they would look at. This was my entry into the nonprofit world. The other reason for this approach was we could show the results to my board and say, you know, this is what we think the competition will bid. And if we bid what they think we're bidding, we're not out of line. We have political cover. We're shown to be prudent. And, you know, we went down that path. The major assumption that I made with the competitor's model was that they had to continue to ratchet down on efficiencies, to get rid of union personnel, cut down on costs, to make it efficient, because their WACC was higher than ours. Their weighted average cost of capital, their hurdle rate had to be higher. So they had those efficiencies. Plus the other thing was, and I think it was probably maybe even a bigger factor than the efficiencies, but their major refinancing risk. We went out 26 to 30 years on our bonds, fixed rate, we're locked and loaded, we're good, we're done. They probably 8 to 10 years, they could get fixed rates. Then they got a major refinancing risk. What are they going to refinance it at? So, I basically looked at their model as having 3 increments of changes into the future, which affected, the price that they could pay. In my mind, the result was that any bid north of $215 million would be unsustainable by a competitor, exclusive of the city payment that Julio was talking about. So on March 27th, LCA bid $205 million as an upfront payment with a $500,000 annual city payment. The bid placed us within 10% of the highest bid. And this is insidious. I mean, 10% of the highest bid. Who's the highest bid? Are you the highest bid? No, I don't know if I'm the highest bid. Might be the other guy's the highest bid. Do we raise our price? I don't know. Maybe we ought to raise our price. Maybe they should. Maybe we should stand pat. We didn't know. So we later found out that we were the highest bid. We did raise our bid. But at the same time, American Water raised their bid. Ultimately, and I think Julio had that in some of his presentation, we raised our bid from 205 to 220. They raised theirs from 192, I think, to 205. But they also had, I think, $750 million in annual city payments, and we had $500,000 in annual city payments. So when you looked at the net present value of our combined package compared to theirs, we were probably $5 million or $6 million ahead of theirs. So 2.6?
226
Okay.
total.
So they called that the BAFOS round, best and final offer. The beauty of the BAFOS rounds was that it mitigated the political fallout, as I said before. It also affirmed our prudence in the whole process. And quite honestly, since then, we've never been addressed as to whether we overpaid in this process or not. So then the easy part then was to secure the bonds. Easy part. From the time we won the bid and closed the deal and selling the bond, we decided to use a combination. Well, before I start that, from the time we closed the deal, sold the bonds, we had probably a 3 standard deviation change in the tax-exempt bond market. We went up 100 basis points, 115 basis points. So the original model that we had of 4.5% went to 5.5%. It was mitigated by reducing the price from $220 million down to $211 with the interest rate protection, but it still meant that we had to borrow more to make the payment. So we ended up closing the deal with an all-in interest rate of 5.5%. And in order to fund the $211 million up front, plus one of the other benefits that we included in the financing was we looked out at 5 years of CapEx, and we said, look, we're doing this deal now. Why don't we finance it now? Put it in an account, and it's ready to go. It's locked and loaded again. So we included 5 years of CapEx when we financed the deal, which also gave us an advantage over the privates because the privates couldn't do that as well. So all in, we offered $307 million of bonds to give you your $211 million.
0.5. 211.5.
That's correct. I am corrected. You can see how the negotiation went. So we actually got our bonds rated from S&P with single A. And we also kept our rating AA on the suburban system of Lehigh County Authority, which I think was a little nuance in the deal that a lot of people aren't aware of that is really kind of nifty, because you took the political pressure from the suburban system that said, we don't want to be involved with the city of Allentown. We don't know what's going to happen with their rates down there. We're going to be paying for them. And the people in the city of Allentown were saying, well, we're going to be paying for the people in the suburbs. Everyone is going like this. And so you kept it separate indentures, you kept it separate rate bases, and never the twain shall mix. So it worked out that way. The lessons learned for me were that understanding the politics of a public-to-public is probably more important than understanding the economics. I mean, the politics do become the economics, but along the way, there were times the city had a wonderful team of consultants. PFM, they also had a gentleman named Louis Greenbaum, who had done a lot of deals in the past and knew how to say no again, and then no some more. We had a little thing going because as part of one of these deals as well, anytime you're saying no to the provisions of a contract, you're also reducing the price that you can get. So every time Lewis at one of these meetings would say, well, no, I'm not caving on that provision. I want to keep this. I would go, kerching. And he would look at me. And after a while, he started saying, I know, kerching. But yeah, the city of Allentown did a wonderful job in promoting its position and still getting the money that they got. The other thing that I learned was to get a deal in these kind of environments, each side has to perceive a win of some kind. Even the people that were fighting the city with the city hall meetings. At some point, their win was that Lehigh County Authority, a nonprofit, got in. I mean, we talked to some of them privately after the meetings, and they understood that a nonprofit, maybe not as good as having the city run it, was still better than having a private run the organization. And then the last thing was, don't be penny wise and pound foolish. You know, a full procurement process using a market model to derive the full value really worked for the city in this case. As I said in the beginning, Arl Arndt was the CEO for many years, and I think for 15 years they talked about regionalization. They could never come up with a number. Some of the numbers I saw were very low over the period of time. But going through this process, put it on the table, made it full disclosure, full transparency, so people could see the numbers, work it at an arm's length, and the city benefited. And I think we ended up with a good agreement as well. And so that would be my recommendation and my lessons learned.
Thank you, Ed. I can reinforce the idea that competition among, we'll have questions as soon as the mayor is done. Go ahead, you want a question now?
Yes, if I could.
Okay, but we have one more
I was
panelist.
a participant in the negotiations on behalf of a 501c3 that was aligned with a for-profit operator under a 9713 contract. And it's a delight to hear that everything that we thought is exactly the way the authority was thinking. We came up with the same number that we would have bid. We did not bid because of something the authority knew or felt it knew that we did not. We were unwilling to assume the capital expenditure risk. We assumed that you know more about the pipes underground than we do. And our operator was unwilling to undertake the capital risk, which actually would have been ours, because they didn't feel comfortable about what was under the ground. And as neighbors, you were very fortunate. You must have some feeling as to what's there.
Yeah, that's a wonderful point.
Some of that stuff is 100 years old.
Oh, it's older than that.
And our operator just was not comfortable with that. We actually had the capital commitment, and our number was 220.
Really?
But we weren't willing to do it because the contract was so carefully drawn that we had the really tremendous risk for the capital if the pipe started to go.
Well, that's interesting because one of the things that gave us comfort was the capital expenditures and the provision about major capital expenditures over $1 million. Yeah, that was great comfort in that you could couple pipeline replacements over the course of a period of time and go to council. Well, and in fact, that was interesting too, in that it wasn't going to council for the approval of the major capital expenditure, but it was going to a committee to get that approved. As well, concurrent with that, you would get the capital cost recovery. So we actually got comfort from that, so I thank you.
At the time that I was able to get that into the contract, our operator was so sour, they didn't want, the negotiations were tremendously combative.
Oh, yes.
The chain was, we were doing the same thing.
Correct.
But the point I wanted to make is that Allentown was extremely fortunate to have you next door.
Yes.
And my 501c3, which you can get hold of through David Pryor at any time you want, is there for the exact same purpose where there is no neighboring authority. If you don't have a neighboring authority, the best thing you can do is to get a 501c3 that is dedicated to do what an authority would do, and David knows how to get hold of us.
Well, that's fascinating. I mean, so what you're saying is that this footprint that was used on a local level can be replicated on a national level.
Anywhere.
Right.
Anywhere. And your analysis is exactly right. No private or profit can give as good a result as a governmental entity, which you are, or a 501c3 operating like a governmental entity, but with a for-profit as its operator.
Right.
Now, in our analysis of Allentown, we thought Allentown was so well run and had so many good people that the savings for our taking it over would not be, there'd be some, but not significant.
We did exactly the same thing. We did not put efficiencies into it moving forward because you could see that over the years that they had been constrained in what they could do, and they had already lost a significant amount of people through the political process. So we I think we had somewhere around 3% possibly in some of the later years in terms of a savings.
That's exactly what we assumed.
We were joined at birth.
It's nice to see the competition can bring out the truth on both sides.
Yeah, it really is.
All
Yeah.
competitors see the same situation, and the city was the beneficiary. Similar situation, although a different structure in Scranton City. It is not a city-owned sewer authority. Sewer operation. It is a joint city-borough sewer authority, which is an independent entity, of course, and the city and the borough has asked the sewer authority to put itself up for sale or some other financing agreement to generate cash. The sewer authority is in the face of a consent decree now with multiple rate increases guaranteed. So it's a little different situation, and I'll ask the mayor to expound on what he sees as the advantages to the city of Scranton and the neighboring municipality from monetizing this, which was a normal operation, a normal sanitary sewer authority.
Thanks, Jerry, and I'm glad you saved your $200 million because we might want to tap you in a couple of months. Spread it out. A couple of things, just because this will, in some form, happen over the next 12 months. We actually do control the authority. The mayor appoints 4 out of the 5 seats, but we funded the whole authority when it was founded roughly about 34 years ago. We are a combined system, and we have a decree to separate to a stormwater runoff system, and to the tune of about $200 million would have to be spent over the next 15 to 20 years. In discussions last year, before we had our Supreme Court decision, I had talked with the chairman of the board, and I said, I think it's time that we should look at going outside and having someone else run the authority. And my feelings were this: I've been mayor 12 years, and I've watched the authority, and I've watched the sewage treatment plant, and we've raised the rates, and I think we've kind of got it very strong financially. But I believe cities the size of Scranton do not have the ability to run sewage plants. It's as simple as that. They do not have the expertise. They do not have, because of the way boards come and go. I happen to be in place for 12 years, but a mayor can be there for 4 years, appoint 4 members, a new mayor comes in, a different focus. I think whether a nonprofit, such as what Ed is running, or a corporation should be in charge. And the reason is because of the consent decree. We're in charge of people's water and the sewage system, and that's a very important entity, not only in quality of life, but what businesses that you attract to your community. What is your sewage system like? What is your capacity like? Can you handle new companies to move in on your sewage system. So we felt from as early as 2 years ago that we should go outside, that someone else should run this entity. And then when we had the financial challenges, we had another reason to get involved, because we have some bills to pay. And I think this is something you're going to see throughout Pennsylvania and other cities because of legacy costs, whether it's pensions or health care. I would say probably for Allentown, but I know it's true in Scranton, our health care bill is about $15 million, and $9 million goes to retirees. So that imbalance is going to last for a while, and we're going to need cash. So we believe that it was in the best interest, and we do believe it in the best interest of the people of our community, that we look for someone else to run it. And so we will be entertaining some type of bids, whether it's outright purchase or a lease agreement that you have structured, and that would be a decision made by the board over, I would say, the next 12 months. I will say it's interesting when you talk about don't take the first offer. Last year when we had a real crisis, financial crisis, we did have a private company come in and offer us not only handle what our consent decree was, but coincidentally, magically, the number that we needed for our outstanding bills for the Supreme Court ruling against us, that we'll give you exactly what you need to get out of your trouble. And we figured, well, that means there's a lot more money on that table, so we just better wait until we do our due diligence and our research to make sure that we're going to get what we feel we deserve. And the experience of Allentown has changed our perception, too. Once you did the deal with the nonprofit, with an entity that would be more concerned about, I would think, the public welfare, because you are an authority, that opened our eyes, too. And so I think that over the next year, although I won't be the mayor, but I will have, I guess not a say, but the people on the board are people who I put there. They will be very mindful of quality. We believe, first and foremost, we have an obligation to the people of our community that we deliver the best product, not only to the ratepayers, but if we're going to grow and become successful, you have to have increased capacity and be able to grow. And so we'll be very conscious of who we do the deal with. And we also will look at the dollars, because that will be very important for us. So I think we'll turn it back to you, Jerry, if there's any questions as we get close here.
Thank you, Mayor. Are there questions for?
Yeah, I had a question for Mayor Doherty. In the earlier part of the conference, we were talking about green infrastructure. You mentioned a $200 million bill. It seems to me that dealing with a rate structure where you put a price on the impervious surface, which is contributing to that, and trying to implement a green infrastructure solution may enhance the price you get for your system. And have you given any thought?
They have on that. I know cities like Scranton, we've been very effective over the last 12 years of demolishing buildings, and we have lots, empty lots that are available, and to use those lots as to put the piping and retention ponds underneath those lots inside neighborhoods throughout the city. And so those are discussions we've had over the last year, and that we will do because it's a benefit to the city tremendously, and also adds beautification inside neighborhoods.
Okay. Other questions? Ma'am?
Can you discuss why you went with a lease instead of a sale in Allentown?
Yes, we really never wanted to sell. We just wanted to do a concession lease agreement because our infrastructure was it wasn't like some of the horror stories that people read about. We had we had maintained our plants very well. We wanted to make sure that we kept it like that. In fact, part of the lease agreement says that at the end of the lease of the 50 years, we will receive our plant in the same or better shape than we gave it to them, this year. So I think, although Mayor said that and I think he's right, sometimes because of the capacity, you want to make sure that somebody who can run it and has the expertise to run it should run it. We had a very good workforce. And in fact, one of the plant manager was a consultant. He was retired, and we hired him, Dan Kaplish, as a consultant to help us write the deal, basically, write the proposal. and the agreement, and that worked out really well. So we didn't really want to sell it. I think we with the third largest city in the state in population, we continue to increase dramatically, and we wanted to maintain. I mean, it's the most precious asset that we had, and if we had to monetize it in the future, we could. So we're just kind of looking ahead, beyond the 50 years, and I think we all in council and the administration agree that selling it was not the best deal. If we can get the money now, pay for our debt, and lower our MMO, minimum municipal obligation, and not have to raise taxes. We haven't raised taxes in the city for the last 9 years, and we're still able to pay our bills. So I think it was a decision that we never even contemplated to do.
I would just say that I think most communities feel the way Allentown did it. They don't want to sell the asset. They'll lease it long term, but the taxpayers, the ratepayers, they built it. Their ancestors paid for it. The idea of selling it completely, there seems to be a lot of political pushback on that.
And I would say that I think our deal, I think you alluded to this, that it could be a national deal. I mean, a model nationally for what we've done, as opposed to what other municipalities have done in the past.
The question actually touches on an important tax point that Mr. Rhodes mentioned at the beginning. Although it's caricatured as a lease, it must, for tax purposes, be a sale. Because if it's not a sale, and all that the authority is doing is acting on behalf of the city, then it's the city's bonds, and when they put the money into the pension plan, that's an arbitrage, and bonds would become taxable. So it must be characterized as a sale. And the terribly close question is, with all the restraints that the city has on the authority, does that convert the authority into its agent rather than as to the purchaser? And I think that bond counsel concluded that no, it was in fact for tax purposes a sale. But that's absolutely key, even though it's structured as a lease.
Yeah, because of the laws, we couldn't really floor a bond that wouldn't be non-taxable. So the best, I think we got the best deal that we could because of the way the law is structured.
Well, the other thing that Julio was talking about with Dan Koplish, they developed operating standards that went beyond the concession, that were almost as voluminous as the concession agreement itself. And it holds us to standards in terms of exercising fire hydrants, replacing mains, doing all kinds of things. And we actually had our first meeting with them and went over. They had an inspection of the facilities that a month or two ago they had owned, and went over the things that they saw as being deficient. And we went through this whole exercise. And that's where, when I said the lessons learned in one of these things is to pay attention, to the political end and the big stuff, because you can get upset at that situation, and you can say, my goodness, you were here a month ago, you weren't doing any of this. We've expanded it, but it's not still good enough for your standards. Everything is fine. We're moving forward.
Well, I think the other thing that happened is that every bidder had an opportunity to spend some time looking at the plans, for I think it was a half a day, speaking to Dan Koplish and many of the other individuals who ran the plant, and were able to actually walk through the plants before and look at what our infrastructure actually looks like. I know it's hard to go underneath the water and find it, underneath the ground and find over 100-year-old pipes. But Allentown is an old city.
Yeah. Are there other questions for the panel, sir?
Well, one observation: if you are going to be a seller, so to speak, of municipal assets, before you start the process of the procurement, you want to know what condition your assets are in, because you will get a lot more credibility from bidders if you'll be asked to set up a due diligence room in which bidders can go look at stuff. And If it's complete, even if it's bad news, that's much better off than if a condition is unknown, because bidders will sort of double charge you for that. Just a word of advice.
Well, I think our time is up. I appreciate your attendance, staying so late for this session. Thank you very much for our panel.